Okay, so we're starting class, and basically what I want you to think about for the whole rest of this lecture is why I would show you that video and what that has to do with film class. And then at the end of class, I'll tell you. Just so you're thinking about it, I just want you to be wondering why I actually do that. And the topic, though, for this class is we're still kind of talking about how to read film, how to think about film language, and we're still trying to think about how to read film globally. So those are some of the questions that is basically share desktop thing. I'll put on the PowerPoint. Reading film and good. So just to remind you, this is basically what I'm lecturing about is the assigned reading. So you have the Nichols book that you guys are reading, and those pages, and you'll notice that those pages specifically talk about Kane, which is of course why I'm finding those pages at the same time. It also talks about the focus technique. It talks about diegetic and extra-diegetic sound. These are roughly exams. You need to know what diegetic and extra-diegetic sound are. Those are, I mean, the book will explain those in more detail. I'm not going to, but those are just fancy terms for something that's pretty obvious. Diegetic sound is sound that's actually in the story. So, like if I say, hey, you hear me say, hey. Extra-diegetic sound is sound that they're adding to the story. Right? So, like music, like a soundtrack, or interesting noises. The other thing that engaging cinema talks about is the various interpretive goals and ways of reading. So there's lots of different ways of reading. The Steger book in Globalization, those pages are just an overview of world history and global imagination. So that's mostly should be reviewed for anybody who's taken a world history class. I think everybody should actually know all that already, but most people don't. And that's just an overview. And the reason why I assigned that overview is because in the Thompson chapters that you have to read, Thompson kind of picks up on that, right? So he's assuming that you know all that already, and he starts talking about global networks of communication and media, and he goes back to the 17th century. He starts there and comes up to the present, which for him is 1994. His basic argument is that new forms of media don't just transmit new information. Think about that. They transform spatial and temporal organization of society. And finally, Citizen Kane, that we're watching, the movie that we're watching, is the topic for today is media, right? That's the main subject. And of course, Citizen Kane is a movie about the media industry. And a lot of people at the time when it came out, everybody who was watching it knew that this was not a totally fictional story. That it was that the life story of Citizen Kane seems very, very similar to the real life story of William Randolph Hearst. And William Randolph Hearst has a big castle in California, just like Kane had a big castle in Florida. So it seemed to be directly about something real. Today, we don't have the Hearst Industries, still a big company, but today I think the bigger companies are CNN, so we have Ted Turner, right? Who went out with who's the exercise with Jane Fonda, compared to Jane Fonda. And then we have Fox Television's owner Rupert Murdoch, and these are things that people make. Ted Turner actually owns more land than almost anybody else on the planet. And Rupert Murdoch is the subject of many movies today, and some people think he's quite scary. So let me just see if That's really frustrating. Okay, so that's basically the assigned reading and some of the subjects that we're going to be doing. So the questions that I'd like you guys to think about are these. Who are we when we read a movie? What do we do when we do it? Who are we when we think about globalization? What is our relationship to the media today? And think about how movies and globalization are mediated between us. What is our relationship to the history of media? And the book that I assigned you to read is not just talking about the recent history of media, it's talking about hundreds of years. So when we think about the relationship between movies and audience, right, this is actually more complicated than you might think. I think I've heard a lot of students in the past tell me, Steve, you're overanalyzing the movie. I just know what I like and I watch it, right? And I enjoy it. And you're trying to insert all these political things in there, and you're trying to make me think about it, and I just don't think about it. I just like it or I don't like it. Maybe, of course, in a class you can't do that, but maybe that's true in real life. But I would argue, no, that's not even true in real life. Because the statement, I watch this because I like it. Well, why do you like it? Right? If you're the Hollywood industry, you have to think about that question. Trying to sell movies. But if you're just a person, you might want to ask yourself, why do you like one thing and not another? What's going on in your head subconsciously? So the different kinds of relationships we have between movies, usually we have all of these relationships. There's the emotional. So movies play with our desires, our fantasies, our fears. But movies also give us alternative worlds, so that we can play out our fears and our fantasies. A lot of times we feel powerless. In real life, we feel powerless. On the movie screen, we can kind of feel a little bit more in control of what's going on. So we enjoy that. In real life, you think about your real romantic life and how you live romantically. It's frustrating. In the movie screen, you clear arc, clear plot, where the guy eventually or the girl eventually gets what they want, what happens, or the political problem is solved, or whatever. So there is an emotional relationship. If you just think of a movie like Star Wars, sure, you can say that Star Wars, it's just fun. It's like spaceships flying around, lightsabers, action, it's exciting. And you can say that there's no political message to Star Wars. But actually, Star Wars was conceived as an anti-Vietnam War movie. So there's the evil empire, right? It's taking over the whole world. And then there's the little republic of people fighting against it. He was very deliberately saying empire bad. And you like, and when you say, I like this character and I don't like this, it's like you've already decided who you like in the movie. What makes you like that person? Well, all the evil people sound like Brits, Germans. They look like Germans and they sound like British. Well, and they remind you of the evil empire. After that movie, nobody on planet Earth would go around saying, empire good. Before that movie, they did. So you guys have grown up all your life, your whole life. I think all of you in this room think, yeah, empire is a bad thing. Colonialism is not a good thing. I'm guessing that that's your general bias. Before Star Wars, that wasn't the case. People actually thought colonies might be a good thing. Empires might be a good thing. The United States has lots of colonies. Still now. We just don't talk about it, but we still do. So when I talk about, oh yeah, I just like this movie, there's an emotional relationship. Yeah, and Star Wars was effective at connecting to your emotions, playing with your fantasy side. Other kinds of movies, though, are poetic. Poetic movies encourage intellectual engagement and contemplation of complexity. And the way they do that is that poetic movies are strange. So most people don't like poetic movies because poetic movies force you to think a little bit. And they do that very deliberately. And they usually force you to think by doing something unconventional or something that you're not expecting. But there's other ways of doing it too. Referential movies, a lot of times people watch movies just because they want to learn about the thing. So Abraham Lincoln, you want to know about Abraham Lincoln. So a lot of Spielberg historical movies are basically saying, let's learn about this place. Metacommunicative. A metacommunicative movie is a movie about the nature of film itself. So metacommunicative movies are usually more popular with people who watch a lot of movies. They watch so many movies, in fact, that they see the same plot over and over and over again. So they start to be interested in movies that talk about how movies happen. Static is basically a fancy term for the relationship between you and the writer. So when you write an email to somebody, you're saying, hey, that's a static relationship. You're not just writing to represent reality. You're not just writing to make a statement about reality. Your primary goal in writing is to establish connection. And movies do that too. And then political is to persuade your audience with way of seeing the world. So there's all these things, in most movies, all these things are going on at the same time, and I want you to kind of break it down, thinking about all the ways you're related to. Let me see if he's on yet. All right. All right. Now, so when you're reading a movie like North by Northwest, for example, and you think about all those different ways that you might relate to a movie, you've probably seen Phil's criticism that does all of these things, right? So you've seen film criticism that focuses on the biographies of the directors, the biographies of the actors, the individual style of each, the categories of the style, like neo-realist, expressivist, whatever you want to call it. Then there's national styles, like the French do it this way, the Italians do it that way, the Americans do it that way. There's historical trends, like, okay. Just to be honest, we're not going to be doing much of that. Personally, I find, the focus on Hitchcock's style or Zeffirelli's style or whoever's style, and this is called auteur theory, where directors try to develop something that is definitely them, like a signature thing that they always do. I find that to be really boring. I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm not into hero worship, or I'm not a fan, and that's what a lot of that is. I don't really care about the difference If you're interested in that, though, you can. There are film classes on this campus in the Italian Studies Department and French Studies Department that do that. Another way of looking at movies is the movie's relationship to other movies, and you do this all the time. You're always comparing. So this is like looking at genre, like westerns, action, thrillers, romantic comedies. Movies make allusions to other movies, so we've already seen that when we watch The Untouchables, make an allusion to Battleship Kane. We can think of influence, we can think of parody, and I think this is actually pretty interesting. And so we'll be doing that. Let me just show you where we'll be doing that. Go to, look at the syllabus. Every single time I log on to the computer, it's like I have to re-upload everything. Yeah. Okay, I'll just tell you it's on the syllabus. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be focusing on the genre of the Western, right? So you're going to watch two Westerns. You're going to watch an old Western, and then you're going to watch a new Western. Well, not really. You're going to watch a 1950s Western, and you're going to watch a late 1950s Western. So you're going to see how one movie is very, very deliberately thinking about other movies, right? So you're going to see that. So I think that's actually interesting. We're also going to look at the history of national development and mode of production, technique, technology, economics. So this is especially important. This idea isn't always as important when you're talking about American movies. Americans just assume that Hollywood exists and New York exists. But a lot of other countries really have to struggle to get their own movies out. It's a lot more work. They don't have the financial backing, and as we're going to talk about later, Hollywood is actually hostile to the development of movies in third world countries. Hostile. So when a country like Ghana tries to make its own movies, Hollywood will actively try to stop that. Then the other thing that we're going to read, this relates, when I say ideological interpretation, this is not just politics. Still talking about all those different things that I showed you before. You're talking about feeling, you're talking about information, you're talking about all the different ways people relate to movies. So ideological interpretation is where we try to guess what the ideological biases of the movie are. Symptomatic interpretation, I'm going to go over that in a little bit. Symptomatic interpretation is like ideological interpretation of Marx. So I'll explain why it's Marxism. Of course, the other thing that we do when we watch movies is that we think about audiences. So you'll probably hear critics do this a lot. They'll talk about, well, this audience is going to think about it this way, and that audience is going to think about it another way. And we talked about that in class last time when we were talking about the difference between how Americans are going to understand North by Northwest, how people in Ethiopia understand North by Northwest. But even inside the United States, you can talk about how movies relate to audiences. But it's not only that movies relate to audiences, it's that the film industry tries to create an audience, right? They need to make money. They're not just going to put a movie out there and then hope that it sells. They're going to try to actively create the audience for the movie way before the movie is finished. And this can be a marketing strategy, but it can also be a political strategy. Or you can think of like, say somebody is making a Christian movie, the church is going to organize its audience for the Christian movie, right? Or a political movie, the people are going to organize the audience before the movie is made. So this happened in the 1970s when they first started making movies with African American characters. You had organizations like the NAACP and the Black Panthers who were organizing their audiences before the movie would come out, that the movie had an audience. So another way of looking at movies is just this is getting really fancy. We'll get to this later. The deconstruction of binaries, gaps, and absences. I'm not going to talk about that now, but we'll get to that later. So one of the things I want you to think about is what's the difference between ideological reading and systematic reading. And the main thing that I want you guys to be thinking about is using evidence to show this. So how do you read the filmic language in order to justify your arguments about ideological or systematic? And I'm going to say right now that having read the stuff that you all wrote on Moodle so far, I think most of you are doing a good job. I'm still getting used to it, still figuring it out. So what's an ideological reading? There's actually a lot of different ways to think about ideological. To say that the movie consciously makes an argument for a political theory. Yeah. So when you were watching North by Northwest, some of you said that this is a movie that is consciously making an argument about the Cold War, right? When you have Stormville come on, specifically say, why is the Cold War? What are we doing here? The Cold War is causing us to do all this stuff to each other, right? So a lot of you said this is a movie that consciously does that. But then the question then I would have for you is, okay, I would say, okay, fine, but prove it. So what's your evidence from the movie? Well, one piece of evidence from the movie is that Thornhill says that. So you have dialogue. But then you have other things in it that are more like filmic language that's going on, right? Where you have the action sequences. I think one of you mentioned the way the UN scene was shot, where you have the camera angle really high, and he's like running down on the ground. He looks like a little ant. So you have the perspective that the United Nations make people look really small. That's what you feel really small. So maybe that filmic language, the way the movie is shot, is making it argument. Another way of doing ideological reading is to say that the movie consciously or unconsciously reproduces stereotypes, values, and cultural biases. So we might have stereotypes of women, stereotypes of others, and we might have certain cultural values. So in the case of North by Northwest, what I want you to notice is that, okay, well, let me just go back. One of the stereotypes that some of you noticed is the stereotype of the foreigner, right? This ambiguous foreigner. There's also the kind of weird implication of a homosexual relationship between the enemy spies for no reason. So you have weird stereotypes like that. You also have stereotypes of women, like how women are supposed to act. Now, what I want you to notice, though, is that we could make an argument that this movie reproduces classic American values in the way that it celebrates the individual. Right? So you could say this movie, ideologically, is very American, even though it's made by Hitchcock and British. Because it unconsciously reproduces an individualistic, egocentric, boy gets girl, has sex, buys things. Right, that's America. Notice how one of my ideological readings contradicts the other one. One of my ideological readings is that this is a very American movie ideologically, and my other ideological reading is that this is a movie that's making fun of America. Which is it? We could move to the more sophisticated ideological reading, which is the movie unconsciously reproduces contradictory feelings. All ideologies are contradictory. Let me give you an example of your ideological contradiction. The American dream. Everybody's supposed to be successful, and everybody's supposed to be happy, right? The pursuit of happiness. What does that mean on a daily basis? On a Friday night, that means you study and pursue your dream. Well, Friday night, you go out and hang out and get drunk and consume and enjoy yourself. Right? So there's already, just like on your daily experience, you are always thinking, do I do X or Y? Which do I do? But on a kind of more broader level, you can see that, values are promoted, like freedom, democracy, such, and then people do the opposite of those things on a daily basis. So you could say that the movie unconsciously produces those contradicting ideas. Those are the three different kinds of ideological reading. In the case of North by Northwest, you could say we already looked at the two contradictory feelings. One is very American, it's very individualistic, and two is very critical of American politics at the same time. And these contradictory emotions, one would argue, in the third line, these contradictory emotions are typical of American ideology. The American ideology both promotes certain values and also goes against those values at the same time. Okay. But what is a symptomatic reading? A symptomatic reading is a little different. Symptomatic reading is not really interested in the consciousness of the director. Systematic reading is more shows that the conflicts and problems faced by the characters are effects of deeper social issues. So you may have a particular personal problem. So in the case of North by Northwest, it's a case of mistaken identity, right? That's all it is. He's mistaken for someone else. Adventure ensues, and it gets crazy, right? And it's an absurd tale. It's totally ridiculous. It's very exaggerated, but it's an exaggerated story that shows a deeper social issue. And the deeper social issue is, who are we, and what do we really care about? Do we really care about winning this Cold War, or do we really care about love, or what's going on? What's the deeper, not only the deeper geopolitical issue of Russia versus the United States, but this kind of very daily personal issue of we live in this America and we're not really sure what our identity is. So Thornhill, right? He begins the movie by saying, "I'm boring." He's bored with himself. He can't sustain a relationship. This is the economy we live in. And then the movie proceeds to go all over America, and we have, like, we're kind of confronted with, is this America? Right? So there's a deeper kind of sociological issue going on. But then another symptomatic reading is when you look at the problems with the movie structure and how the movie structure are effects of deeper social issues. So a lot of you noticed problems with the movie structure. We saw, for example, that the romantic relationship between Eve and Thornhill was ridiculous. I think everybody thought that. That's a problem, right? So what does that problem tell us about American culture in general? Right? That's a structural problem in the plot. And we can look at the movie and just say, whatever. You didn't do a very good job of telling a story. But on the other hand, we might want to say, this movie is appealing, this movie has been successful in the past. What do we make of that structural problem? What does that structural problem tell us about American society? Does that make sense? So those are symptomatic. So I wanted to talk about how we use evidence when we do this. So let's say if we look at this, I already talked about this before. So we want to make an argument one way or another. Right? So here we have, now the argument that I want to make is that, in my view, is that North by Northwest very deliberately makes the American landscape and American identity seem a little funny and strange. And on the one hand, it seems to be forcing or asking the reader to think about what American identity is and what American politics are. On the other hand, it's not totally critical of it. It's not celebratory at the same time. It's creating what we might call self-consistency, making you, as a reader, you kind of feel like, on the one hand, you identify with what you're seeing, on the other hand, you listen to stuff like it. Right? That's what it's doing. So the way it does that, I think, is by playing with a lot of the conventions of film. So here you have the establishing shot. It's a long view camera take. And it's slow. The car comes into view. And there's nothing else there, and it's so flat, and it's so desolate, and you're wondering what's going on. The man gets out. You assume that it's story now, but you don't really know. You're kind of probably wondering why this scene is even happening, because you just had the scene where he's going to go meet Van Damme, and now he's in the middle of nowhere, and you're confused. Then we have the medium shot, so there's continuity, so we tell. Then we have point of view shot. Now we have a close-up. He looks. Now we have another point of view shot. He looks again. We have another point of view shot. He looks again. We have another point of view shot. There's the plane. Okay. Things to notice for future directors. If anybody wants to direct. Notice that he turns his head, and then we have the point of view shot. And he turns his head, and then we have the point of view shot. Why does that matter? Okay. So you're making a movie. And you think that the actor is just acting, right? You think that the actor is basically told, you've heard this probably, all these actors are like, I wanted to learn this character, so I studied the character. I lived with the poor people, and now I know what it's like to be poor, and now I can really do this because, you know, I got into their soul. Bullshit. When you're making a movie, that's not what happens. The director says, turn left, look up. Now turn right, look down. There's a famous scene in which an actor, a theater actor, actually said to Hitchcock, I don't want to look down. I don't think this character would do that. I think this character would go like this. And Hitchcock says, I don't care. The camera needs to do that. Look up, because there's something over there, and I need to show that later. Right? So that's how you make it. That's how you make it. So every time he looks in a different direction, then the camera goes where his eyes are, and it's really slow, and he is totally confused. Right? You feel his confusion. His face is confused. He looks again, nothing. And now parts coming, excited. Nothing. So you see the editing is like it shows his face. And this is classic point of view shot, and then close-up shot. Okay, by now you're like, wait a minute, really? This just keeps happening, and you're supposed to be laughing right now because this camera work is ridiculous. Hopeful, nothing. The other thing to think about when I'm talking about how they film this, where are the cameras, right? You don't see the cameras. So they didn't film these things. They didn't have a scene where he just acted this out of the cars and stuff. They filmed him doing this. And then they filmed the cars going by. Later, they could do that the next day. And you put the film together to make it happen. So now we have this kind of classic identity crisis where you have this really wealthy man from New York City who's in the middle of a cornfield and so confused with his speech security. He doesn't know who he is anymore or why he's there. And then we have one of the most hilarious scenes he's got. And you have this wonderful framing shot all of a sudden. That, when you're just doing the point of view shot, you're in the character's head. Then you suddenly get to this it kind of comes back to an establishing shot, except it's not an establishing shot anymore because everything's already been established. Now it's just a medium shot that kind of reminds you of the ridiculousness of the situation. Close up, 32 shot, close up. Now we have a tracking shot. And notice he starts walking forward, and now the camera's moving, so the point of view shot is different. Okay, so for me, what this kind of does is it starts to kind of produce in the audience. This is actually poetic in the way it produces in the audience kind of discomfort. Now how do I get to that? Not really what I want. Okay, so the other thing, though, just going back to this. But for me, this is a movie that, on the one hand, it's a movie that's making an argument about American identity, and it does that by making you feel strange. It uses the camera technique to do that. It also does that by playing with the symbols of America. So especially at the Mount Rushmore scene, where you have a scene with the presidents of the United States symbolizing American democracy, and you have these people running around on the face of them and shooting each other, and basically it's ridiculous. And so that movie, that kind of creates a kind of strange reaction where we actually start to think about, like, what is American democracy anyway? What are the symbols? What do these symbols really mean? What are we fighting about? Are we fighting for these statues of George Washington? That's kind of the issue. Okay. Now, the question that you guys thought of when we were talking last class on Wednesday is, when we were talking about the meaning of Mount Rushmore and the meaning of the ironic American politics, I asked you if you thought that people from other countries would relate to the themes of Mount Rushmore and the political symbolism of the thing, right? or would understand the political symbolism of a cornfield. For America, the cornfield is like the heartland, the breadbasket. Would people from other countries relate to that? So the question that we started to think about, you just thought about it naturally on your own, was what does this movie mean outside of the United States? Now, and this is a very interesting question, because if you remember when I showed you what was playing in the movie theaters in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, what was playing in the movie theater was Django Unchained. That was 2 weeks ago. It was an American movie every single hour, right? And right now, actually, I went back and checked the Zero Dark 30. That's just like Zero Dark 30. So the question that Thompson raises in the thing that you have to read is that media is dominated by a few American and European multinational corporations. So if you go to countries around the world, you're watching American television and American TV. And also, Thompson explores this in more detail, and I'm not going to belabor the point. But Thompson goes to show that it's not just that it's American dominance; it's a few companies, like 5 companies, that own almost everything. And so the question that people are wondering is, are they controlling the message that's out to the American public? Right? And not just the message that gets out to the American public, but the message that gets out to the whole world. I think this is why when Al Jazeera came out with new media production, it was such a revelation, because suddenly when Al Jazeera started telling the story, and they did a much better job than CNN and Fox, people were like, oh, that's what happened? Why is it Fox News and CNN telling it? And so that kind of made the cultural imperialism of the United States very visible. And the cultural imperialism thesis is a thesis that came about in the 1960s, and it suggests that America spreads its values, which egoistic consumerism, and its propaganda to other countries. And this is something that America actually does. In fact, one of my friends, one of the guys who helped set up this course, actually worked for the U.S. State Department for an organization called Voice of America. And Voice of America is basically radio and television that reproduced in all the languages of the world. And that's the State Department does that. So that's the cultural imperialism thesis, that America owns all the media and Europe owns all the media, and that it uses the media to spread its values in its political case. Thompson actually does not agree with that a little bit. You can't deny that the United States and Europe own a lot of these companies. You can't deny that Fox Television or CNN promote America's political agenda. That's all really obvious. But Thompson argues that this is more complicated for a lot of reasons. One, ownership is transnational and shifting, so Japanese companies now own a lot of this stuff. Chinese companies now own a lot of stuff. And then you have the case of Al Jazeera, which is very successful. And since Thompson made his argument, actually Saudi Arabia stuff. When I was in Ethiopia, by the way, this is actually funny. I was having lunch with this young woman, or not a young woman, she was middle-aged woman, she had 2 kids, Ethiopian woman. And she was telling me how pissed off she was that her kids were starting to speak Arabic at home because all the satellite TV stations were owned by people from the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. And so I said, what do you want them to be speaking at home? She said, well, I want them to be speaking Amharic. And I said, well, all the television before was owned by the United States, so they weren't, you just moved from like English to Arabic. And actually, when I say it's Arabic, they're still showing American television shows. They're just dubbed in Arabic. It's still American television shows dubbed in Arabic, produced on Arab satellite television. So anyway, point being, ownership is transnational shifting. So that's Thompson's argument that the cultural imperialism should be rethought. He also argues that the way media is received and read is not passive. It's not like people just read American or watch American television like what's that stupid thing that everybody watches? Star Power. All those shows that you discover the next talent. America's Got Talent, American Idol, blah blah blah, Dancing with the Stars. Or we're talking about like whatever television show, Friends, whatever. You watch a show like Friends, and you're like, yeah, New York is exactly like that. But anyway, the point is that when people read these shows, it's not like we watch them passively and just say, yeah, that's American values. That's what I am. Nobody reads that. You don't read that. Ethiopians don't read that. French people don't watch shows that way. The thing that Thompson really argues is that he argues for a theory of self-discipline. So he says when people in third world countries like Ethiopia watch American media, they don't adopt. They don't just watch what happens in American media and say, yeah, that's what we should do. Rather, they interpret, they adapt, and they use it as an imaginative space to think differently. So they're basically saying, oh, that's really weird, the way these Americans all run on the beach and ski. And then they think about their own society, and they wonder if they should do something differently. And guess what? Nobody in Ethiopia ever said, yeah, let's go run on the beach. Right? Nobody's doing that. But they are watching the shows and they're thinking, and they are thinking differently. They use it as the same way that you might use a science fiction story where you're imagining life on other planets. That's how people in other countries watch American movies. It's like watching science fiction. It's like watching something that's happening on Mars in space. So that's his argument that complicates the cultural materialism argument. Now, I personally have some problems with Thompson's argument. For one, he doesn't pay attention to the non-Western forms of culture, media, and economy that are pretty important. So I think we need to think about that. He also ignores the role of traditional forms of culture within the modern forms. So he only focuses on modern forms of culture. Newspapers, radio, television, movies. But he doesn't think of the older forms of culture that are still very powerful and have a relationship. So when you watch TV shows, the church is on it. But also, the church has its own television, and also people watch the stuff inside the church. So there are relationships between things that he's not. And this is the one that I think is really important for you guys. Third one. Thompson failed to observe that while other countries regularly practice self-distancing when they watch American, European, and Latin American media, people in the United States are unique because they don't regularly practice that. Okay? So in France and Japan, every time when I was in Europe, and when I was in Africa, and when I was in Asia, everybody watched American television. They also watched European television. They also watched Asian television. They also watched Latin American television. Everybody. In the United States, most of you only watch American television. So, if Thompson's argument is that people in other countries practice self-distancing, where they look at television from other countries, and then they can imaginatively critique their own society and think about it different, then you have to ask yourself, what's happening to American culture because we don't do that? We are so narcissistic and so full of ourselves that we're the only country that doesn't actually watch television in other countries on a regular basis. So we are never practicing that self-discipline unless we watch science fiction. Yeah. How many people watch BBC in the United States? Yeah. I mean, I would say BBC and Al Jazeera, yeah, people who do that. But we're talking like 1% of the population. Right? So yeah, BBC. And I mean, I watch movies and watch television in other countries as much as I can, but you know. So, and the other thing that he ignores is what about money, profits, infrastructure, and the location of cultural production? Because of course, you have Los Angeles and New York where you have a whole economy that's very vibrant, that's based on production and exportation. And other countries, because they're not exporting their culture, they don't get to build all the infrastructure and all the cool stuff. You know, all the cool stuff that goes along with having a nice media culture, which includes everything from cafes. I mean, think about how much money that is. I think a lot of people think that the United States, the biggest sector of the U.S. economy is technology. So you have to become an engineer because technology is the backbone of the United States. Or you have to be a banker because that's the backbone of the United States. And actually, the number one export, the number one thing that the United States exports is media culture. So, here's my problem with, I'm going to repeat it. My problem with Thompson's argument is he fails to observe that while other countries regularly practice self-distancing when they watch the stuff, we don't. So what about Hitchcock's North by Northwest? This is what we were wondering. What does Mount Rushmore mean to these people? Right? So I started to think, what if we imagine a totally different movie called South by Southeast, and we're interpreting North by Northwest globally? Does North by Northwest spread American values, anti-political individualism, and sexual promiscuity? I don't think it does. Or, if you're thinking of North by Northwest for promotion of American values, it's strange that North by Northwest seems to be very critical of American values. And then we have the symbolism of the United Nations, cornfields, and Mount Rushmore. And finally, going along with Thompson's thesis, maybe non-American audiences are not laughing with the joke, they're laughing at the joke, but not for the reason we think it's hilarious. So these are all the kind of things that we're thinking about when we think about North by Northwest globally. But for you guys, what I want you guys to think about is what if somebody in the Oromia region of Ethiopia, where all of our people are from, what if they made a movie and you were going to watch it from there? Right? What would that look like for you? What would be the politics? Do you even recognize the politics? Everybody recognizes the politics of the Cold War in the United States, and maybe they don't. But what would be the case of the state United in Ethiopia? What would that be about? And what symbolism? Instead of the United Nations, would we have the African Union headquarters, the Hilton Hotel? Instead of cornfields in the middle of nowhere, would we have coffee and shot farms? The walls could be a Farrar, ancient churches in Lalibela, created in the Solid National Forest. So I thought I'd put some of these pictures up in front. I actually took these pictures when I was there. So there's the African Union building, right in the middle of Ethiopia. It looks somewhat like the UN, it's related to it. Here's the Hilton Hotel, which is featured in the movie Shaft in Africa. Wonderful swimming pool over here, which is naturally heated by volcanic stuff. There's mountain farms. It's really beautiful. Where they grow coffee. A lot of, you guys know that coffee comes from Ethiopia, right? Shot and test. That's a good grade. There's some children playing in Harar. I'm actually really proud of this shot I took after the girl in the air. Get on the side. So I'm thinking also, when you guys have your stereotype images of Ethiopia, you think of poverty, or you have your stereotype images of Jerusalem, that American movies will show you, right? American movies will show you poverty in Ethiopia or Islam around the world. They probably don't show you pictures that look like this. But this is daily life. I did not take this picture. This is just from the internet. Here's one of the famous churches in Lalibela. It's thousands of years old. and they basically carved the church into the rock. So it's a big rock, and they carved the church out of the rock. Um, so leveling down. So I was thinking, like, if I were going to make a movie like North by Northwest that's set in Ethiopia, these are all the things that I would show. Here's the famous cave with all space. So cinematic images and meaning. When we're thinking about how we interpret film global images, or when we're thinking about interpreting movies globally, what do the images I just showed you mean to Ethiopia? What would they mean to you? I can tell you that for anybody in Africa and a lot of Asia, they all know what the African Union means, but you guys might not. And they know the politics for why the African Union is in Ethiopia and not in Ghana. But you wouldn't, or maybe some of you would. But it begs the question of what images are recognizable symbols and what aren't. So now I want to talk about Citizen Kane and technique and critique, and this is the movie that you're watching now. And the reason why I'm having you watch this movie, obviously, is because Citizen Kane is a movie about movies. Citizen Kane is a movie about media. And writer and director Orson Welles is famous for the War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938 that caused many listeners to actually believe they're being invaded by aliens from Mars. So we went on the radio, we started talking about this Martian invasion, and he acted like it was a news broadcast and everybody believed. Not everybody, but people believed. Because he's making fun of the power of media. Citizen Kane is a movie he made a little bit later. It sounds like William Randolph Hearst, and they actually tried to suppress this movie. But Citizen Kane was controversial enough that it was they actively tried to prevent it from coming out. And you'll notice that at the beginning of Citizen Kane, when you watched it, it begins with a newsreel. It begins with news media. And it begins by talking about how Kane had this palace in Florida where he had animals and plants and art from all over the world. So if you want to talk about Hearst's relationship with the world, he tries to own everything, right? Everything in the world he tries to put in his house. Now, thinking globally in the context of cultural pluralism, is this a movie that promotes American culture, assumptions, and values? It's certainly about a famous American media guy, but the movie seems to be very critical of it. And one of the techniques, if you want to kind of talk about how the filmic language, the technique of making this film, shows you that critical sensibility, is that he uses a deep focus technique to juxtapose foreground and background and emphasize relationships, contrast, causality, perspective. And he has strange camera angles throughout. So I want to show you some of those. Put in the Citizen Kane movie. Show you what I'm talking about. How are we doing on time? We have 15 minutes. Okay. Good. some of the terms that I went over at the beginning of the class, extra diegetic sound, right? So that's the Now, I want you to kind of think about camera technique. We're panning up, right? Very slowly and ominously. And you see this, you're looking through a barbed wire fence. You're looking through a fence. And then you have this huge castle in the background. I want you to look at what the camera, how the camera looks from it. What the camera does. It moves forward, right? Now you're focusing, the camera's focusing a little bit more. Now it's showing you focus a little bit more. All right. You want to know something really cool? That's a drawing. Somebody just drew that, and the camera is actually just focusing on the drawing, showing you the parts of the drawing. But it gives you the illusion that it's a real thing. That's why the camera moves around. Now we're focusing. Notice how the extra diegetic sound of music corresponds to what's seen. Cross that to this. Okay. Good. Then fall down. Great. That's the deep focus shot. When we talk about deep focus, right? We had in the near view, we have so when we talk about deep focus, that's the first example. There's a lot of examples in this movie of that type of shot where you have something in the foreground and something in the background. So he says rosebud, blah, 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 blah.
You on the mark.
Okay, so then we immediately move to this news reel, right? So what we're seeing here, Citizen Kane. Kane is a media guy, and now we're going to watch this executive on the news that he did. Right? So this would be like television news.
Almost as necessary and smaller than Xanadu. Well, largest private photograph. Here on the desert of the Gulf Coast, a private cargo was commissioned and successfully built. 100,000 trees, 20,000 tons of marble are the ingredients of Xanadu Mountain. Monuments of Xanadu Palace. Paintings, pictures, statues, the very stones of many other palaces. A collection of everything. So big it can never be catalogued or traced. Enough for 10 museums, the look of the world.
Right, so we're thinking about globalization. He's basically trying to be like, what's his name? Noah, right? Noah's Ark, like his house. It's a really weird idea to think that the whole world could be on one of those things.
Xanadu's livestock, the fowl of the air, the fish of the sea, the beast of the field of the jungle, all these, the biggest private zoos and so on. Like the railroads, Xanadu's land aware of it. Xanadu is the costliest monument a man has built for himself.
So what we had there was a montage of all these different elements of Xanadu.
Here in Xanadu last week, Xanadu's landlord was laid to rest. A broken figure of last century. America's Tutankhamun. Charles Boston Kane.
Notice that it's happening in all these different languages. Of course, the idea is maybe seeing like a lot of the newspapers.
I know that.
Okay, so basically what the movie is really pretty obvious. I know you guys all got this. But, what this movie set up is it gives you the way the media generally reports on stuff, right? So you see that, and then immediately it says, but that's not enough, right? What does rosebud mean? The rosebud is just a symbol for what we really want to know, which is the real truth behind what the media presents, right? And then the whole movie is like the journalist going to all these different people, interviewing all these people about who Kane, and getting very different perspectives on depending on who the person is, and also finding out very uncomfortable truths about him. So, in a certain sense, then if you're thinking ideologically and you're thinking about this as a critique of the movie industry, putting this in the context of cultural imperialism, how is this a movie that's just kind of exemplifying or repeating cultural imperialism? Like here's this American media guy that's promoting the whole world is supposed to be interested in this, or is it kind of actually criticizing this whole idea? So, I'm going to skip ahead. Here's another example of deep focus for the next scene. So the first person that he goes to interview is the second wife. And there you have a little bit of deep focus there. He's drunk. This is a really great example of deep focus, right? In the foreground, you have him. The journalist. He's on the phone talking to his editor, trying to get the story. In the background, you see her drunk and she's depressed, right? The contrast between the background and the foreground is the meaning of this scene, right? So that you really feel like, man, this is screwed up. But you also feel like there's a contradiction, there's a definite disconnect between what he's after and what she's after, and this contradiction has to kind of be resolved, and it creates a tension in the movie, an emotional tension, but also political and ideological tension between how we understand the relationship between what we see on the media and the reality of people's lives. And this is basically the deep focus thing. Now, if you're imagining Hitchcock do this scene, Hitchcock would probably do the scene very differently, right? Hitchcock didn't do the deep focus. He also didn't do what was so moody. So, he would have this kind of more cheerful, like, thing. There's two people talking, and you do close up on one, close up on the other, so go back and forth. It would be a lot faster and more silly. So that's a different style of doing that. Okay. So, yeah. Okay, I'll get to the Juno Mars thing in a second. Here's a question for you reading assignment. How do we read this movie ideologically? How do we read it systematically? What techniques, shot scenes, editing do we notice? And are those things evidence for our ideological systematic? So basically, when you're making an argument for how you read the movie, don't forget that you need to back it up with evidence. Here's the shot. This is what this shot shows. And that's what I just did. I was talking about that shot. But now I want to talk about the Bruno Mars, okay? So Bruno Mars, sorry, not Juno Mars. Why did I write Bruno Mars? I don't know why I wrote that. Hitchcock and Wells both have very different styles, but both use a lot of editing and sophisticated camera techniques. So far in this class, I've been really trying to make an argument for why editing and camera shots are the basic ideas of film. But when you see this video, when you see this video, right? He does the hand thing, right? That's a camera thing. And what that image is like basically he's using the webcam on his laptop, right? That's really recognizable. So like this would be like if you were going to make a video for your friends and share it with your friends, he's basically reproducing that. So that's the formal convention that he's going on. So he does this. He pulls it. Notice though, it seems like this would almost seem to be the video that contradicts everything I've just been saying. So I've been saying you've got to do the camera moving around, you've got to do all this stuff. He just has the webcam pointing straight ahead, and yet he makes a really interesting film. However, notice the hands. Hands, right? There's no monkeys. Now they're monkeys, right? So the hands are functioning the way the camera works. He's using the choreography to actually do the thing for the camera. And so I think it's really revealing because it forces you to think what a camera does. Because he's basically using dancing to do that. So when you think of when you're watching a movie, you need to think of like all the camera shots are choreographed, and the most important character of the movie, in my opinion, is always the camera. But Bruno Mars is a pretty smart guy, so he's basically using the dancing to do a lot of that. Today I don't feel that. You don't need to move it. You need to fix it. So then he does this, right? So you can't see him. So he's basically, the bodies of the other characters are basically doing what a camera does when a camera cuts, right? So he said he's putting the body of the monkey in front, and then we're not going to have a zoom. right? If the camera doesn't zoom, instead, he's going to come forward. And I think later he does the thing with the chair. Now he's doing a W, although there's not. He comes back. Oh, yeah, here's the thing with the chair, right? So we don't zoom, the camera doesn't zoom if he's zooming. Now we do this. Right? Sorry, I'm running out of time. When the other guy comes on and he goes under the desk and stuff, he gets into this later. Oh yeah, so then he does that with his hand, right? So that's a cut. That guy comes in. And there's a scene where they all go to bed, right? Makes everybody go on the bed. Like a point of view shot, except instead he's directed. So when you're doing camera editing, with the camera editing, you have the character look this way, and then the camera does something like that, right? Bruno Mars basically he points, and then the monkey comes in. Now here's an important part though that makes that scene work, and it's really essential to all camera editing, and we haven't talked about it yet. And Bruno Mars is an expert in it. It's the face and faceless. When you're editing and you're showing what you see, sometimes you see faces and sometimes you don't. And the faceless monkeys are what organize the scene. It's cut, it's framed, it's perspective, and it's precisely because they don't have a face that this works. And part of my point here is that I want to be making is that anybody could have made this video, right? Bruno Mars take that video probably could, I don't know how much it actually cost, but you guys can make that video for no money at all. So special effects do not need to be expensive. Like, you actually know what you're doing when you're doing editing. You can see here he didn't even have to do any cuts. But he's thinking of how people make movies. He's aware of how that works. So I wanted to kind of point that out to you, and I will put this on YouTube and what? And I will put this on YouTube. I will put this PowerPoint on the thing and on Google. I will make a YouTube video of it. And I'm going to try to fix the problems that I seem to be having with my friends there. So we'll get back to it. So, class over.